I'm going to make the argument that Buddhism turns out to be one of the main contexts for cross-cultural circulation of medical ideas in world history. I'll say that again. Buddhism is one of the main drivers of cross-cultural medical exchange in history. Period.
Welcome to the first talk in our speaker series celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Buddhism Psychology and Mental Health Program, or BPMH. This lecture is co-sponsored by BPMH, the Robert H. Ho Family Foundation Center for Buddhist Studies, the Buddhism and Psychology Student Union, and the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. I'm Frances Garrett, Associate Professor of Buddhist Studies and the Director of the BPMH program. Founded in 2006, BPMH is an undergraduate minor hosted by New College at the University of Toronto. As the largest undergraduate Buddhist Studies program in North America, it's internationally known for its leadership in contemplative science education. BPMH's transdisciplinary curriculum integrates research by scientists, philosophers, Buddhist studies scholars, health practitioners, and contemplatives. Like many schools, University of Toronto supports extracurricular mindfulness workshops across campus. But BPMH is the only program on campus in which students can engage in deep and sustained study of the science, histories, practices, and global indigenous cultures associated with mindfulness and other contemplative or therapeutic practices from a multidisciplinary perspective, using transdisciplinary and decolonial methods in a suite of academic courses. In addition, coursework is enhanced by co-curricular programming, including research labs, active student groups, public events, a long-running student undergraduate journal, online publishing, and podcasting, which together reach tens of thousands of participants yearly and which have brought international recognition to the program. We should acknowledge that for this lecture, we were gathered on the site that has for thousands of years been the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and it's still home to many indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. A land acknowledgement can't undo violent histories against indigenous people on these lands, but as a community, we can work to uproot colonial legacies that impact all of us. So that brings me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Pierce Salguero, who is the perfect person to begin our 20th anniversary lecture series. Dr. Salguero is a transdisciplinary scholar who has thought deeply about historical and contemporary intersections between health, spirituality, and cross-cultural exchange. He has a PhD in history of medicine from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and he teaches courses on Asian history, religions, and health humanities at Penn State University's Abington College near Philadelphia. Dr. Salguero is the author of many books, articles, and edited volumes on Buddhism and medicine, historically and today. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Asian Medicine, and he's the producer and host of the popular Blue Barrel podcast. You can learn more about his work if you follow the links to his websites provided in the video notes here. So now I'll turn you over to Dr. Pierce Salguero.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Frances. We were just reflecting, Frances and I, on the way over, that we've known each other for 25 years. I was just starting my master's degree program when she was finishing up her PhD at University of Virginia. And you've always been a little bit like of a mentor for me, a couple years ahead, kind of blazing the trail. And all of the things that Frances was just talking about that her program has been doing here have been very much at the center of what I'm interested in as well. So I feel very kindred, aligned career, almost like, half my life sort of traveling in parallel with Frances and learning a lot from you. So thank you for the opportunity to come and to speak to all of you. It's my pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start by telling you a story that I call The Monk and the Centipede. I graduated from college in the late 1990s, and was interested in indigenous healing practices, particularly in Asia. I went to Asia because I had never actually experienced anything there for myself. My family's from South America, so people ask me why didn't I go to South America. I already spoke Spanish. I don't know. Something drew me to Asia. I spent 7 years in between my college and my returning for graduate school, really practicing, being a practitioner of not only Buddhism, meditation. I spent a lot of time in meditation centers and monasteries. I also was practicing I was learning the practice of traditional Thai medicine. I thought I was going to be a healer, right? A practitioner. Turned out, after many years of doing that, there was kind of a fork in the road, and I went the scholarly direction. But at the time of this story, I was a practitioner in a forest monastery on the far east of Thailand, quite far away from any kind of towns or cities or hospitals, and I was spending the summer there. And my job and the job of other lay people, I wasn't a monk, but our job was to sort of help out with clearing some brush and sweeping the pathways. It's a forest monastery. There's lots of, the jungle is kind of all around and trying to constantly grow back. And anyhow, the question of like, why are we sweeping these leaves out of the way, and what might be under the leaves if we don't sweep them out of the way, got answered one night when a colleague of mine, a friend, somebody who was at the monastery with me, was bitten by, that's me at the monastery with my shaved head, but he was bitten by a dakab. So a dakab, you don't have these in Canada. They're like this big. Just for perspective, here's a man's leg. They're very large, poisonous centipedes. They live under the brush. Under the leaves, and this dakab crawled up his leg and bit him kind of in the groin. These are very serious insect bites. He had some kind of allergic reaction to it. His body seized up, and he started having a critical emergency in the forest, far away from any, like I was saying, from any hospitals or doctors or whatever, and we didn't know what to do. We ran and we grabbed the doctor monk. And he came and checked out this colleague of ours as he was collapsing and having trouble breathing. And the doctor monk told us, so he had a particular herb that was growing there in the forest that he concocted, or he made a tea with this, mashed up the herb and steeped it in hot water and so forth. And he told us to give that to our friend every hour, give him one of these, cups of this decoction, and to all the rest of the night, all the rest of the times that he wasn't drinking that, for us, this is a group of maybe 5 or 6 of us, to sit around with our friend and to chant, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. You all may know that chant. It's a sort of a standard Southeast Asian homage to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And so we did this. Now, at the time, I was 23, I think, 24 years old. I had come from a Western culture where, in my mind, those things were pretty clearly, one was medical and the other was kind of like religious or magical. Right? I knew that the monk was having us do this because we were calling on the powers of the Buddha to come help the patient. Or so I thought. So in my mind, I had these two categories. Religion's one thing, medicine's another. Here they're being put together, but they're sort of like separate things. And I changed my mind that night. And the reason I changed my mind was because I watched what happens when somebody's having a medical crisis and they're surrounded by friends who are calling on, supernatural powers or hidden powers or greater powers to help with this situation. I saw the social aspect of this therapy that the Dr. Monk had asked us to do. But I also saw something about the chanting. So if you haven't heard people chant in Southeast Asia, when they do this chant, there's a very kind of like monotonous, and there's a monotonous tone and a cyclical thing you do with your breathing, right? So it's like, It's like, it's not like that. It's it's a lot more monotonous. And it's Namo Tassa Bhagavato, and you like use all your breath, and then you pull in some more. Arahato Samma, right? There's a whole thing that you're doing with your breathing. And we were doing that, and he was struggling to do that. His whole body was gripped up. He was having almost seizures, right? His torso was all rigid. And he's struggling through that to do that kind of chanting. Right? Struggling. And I watched what happened when somebody who's struggling in that way regulates their breathing through this chant. And I watched how the breathing itself sort of started to loosen up his torso. And the cyclical nature of the breathing started to sort of like relax him in a way. What I saw through the night was that this therapy that I thought was magical, that I thought was religious, actually turned out to have a ton of wisdom in it. Not just maybe because it was invoking the powers of the Buddha, but it had very practical social components. It had a whole physiological component to it that I was ready to just ignore because I was thinking this is magic, this is religion, right? So that night changed my life. I became interested in the relationship between Buddhism and medicine. I have now, as Francis was saying, had a 25-year career since that time where I've been studying what does Buddhism have to do with health? What does Buddhism have to do with medicine? And I don't just mean mindfulness when I say that. I don't just mean what can we put under a brain scan and see, from a biomedical scientific lens. I mean the whole range of what Buddhism has to offer, from meditation to ritual to diets to lifestyle advice to exorcism of demons and everything else that Buddhists have done all across the planet for 25 centuries, and what they continue to do today, because Buddhism is still, to this day, as you all probably are very aware, completely intertwined with health and well-being. That's one of the main focuses of Buddhism. And so there's just this huge story to tell about Buddhist medicine, about this relationship between Buddhism and medicine. So meanwhile, over the last 25 years, I've met all kinds of other friends and colleagues, such as Francis, who are working on this topic as well. And so I've been, I would say, more of a generalist, while others have been more kind of specialists. I have done my own specialized research in contemporary Thailand, but I also went back to graduate school, trained in Chinese language, reading Chinese Buddhist scriptures, and that's sort of my area of primary language research. But I have turned into a little bit of a generalist, and so some of my earlier work was on Thailand and medieval China, and then it kind of developed into like Buddhism globally, the global history of Buddhism and medicine, contemporary Buddhism and medicine around the world. So I'm sort of talking here today as like big picture, zoomed out, generalist, more kind of broad kind of scope of what I'm going to talk about. So along the way, somewhere during my studies and my thinking about this topic, I decided that I was going to call what I study Buddhist medicine. And that's actually kind of been a controversial subject. People have criticized me. Other scholars have criticized the use of that term. So you could think about what I'm doing here today as really kind of just defending that term, but I think it's really useful. I think it's really useful to think about Buddhist medicine. And so what is Buddhist medicine? I'm going to use that term in the same way that some people might use the term Buddhist art. So what is Buddhist art? Well, I don't know. Like, Chinese Buddhist art looks different than Buddhist art in Myanmar, right? Buddhist art in Tibet in, I don't know, the 8th century, 10th century looks totally different than a Japanese manga from like published yesterday that has to do with Buddhism, right? Buddhist art is not one thing. It's culturally specific. You might say Buddhist art is what Buddhists do when they're expressing art in Buddhist ways, but it's very culturally specific, historically specific. It changes. Maybe there's some underlying themes, but it's a fuzzy category, right? It's not like yes or no, this is Buddhist art. right? So I'm using Buddhist medicine the same way. Buddhist medicine is the kind of medicine, it's the kind of healing that Buddhists do in Buddhist places, kind of in the Buddha's name or as part of a Buddhist cultural or social context, right? Buddhist medicine looks different. If you're in Bangkok in the 19th century, Buddhist medicine might look like these diagrams of pressure points where you're supposed to massage somebody. This is a diagram from a temple in Bangkok. You know, here's a picture of chakras from Tibet. You know, here's a hospital from the Khmer Empire in the 12th century. Here's a set of documents that were discovered in the Silk Road. They span 600 years or 700 years of medieval Chinese writings about Buddhism and medicine. You know, the contents are different from place to place. The way it looks and the styles of the art can be different from place to place. And I'm interested in sort of the bigger picture, all of this, studying all of this as a field of study, right? Thinking about Buddhist medicine as not a thing, but a whole open area of inquiry. So I've been, like I said, looking at this in a more global kind of way. And recently, this was now about 4 years ago, I published a book that I would say it took me 20 years to come to this. After having spent time as a practitioner, after having met and engaged with all kinds of different colleagues and specialists, having done my own research, finally coming around to thinking about putting together a book that was going to do a big, broad overview, right, of the global history of Buddhism and medicine. And so I kind of laid out in the book, you could say, like 4 different periods of Buddhist medical history. There is the early foundational period that we find the tradition in India developing sort of the core early ideas that then expand all across Asia throughout the first millennium, so the first 1,000 years AD. And then I got into the regional differences and how Buddhist medicine kind of develops differently in China than it does in Tibet, than it does in Southeast Asia, et cetera. And then the modernization and the globalization of Buddhist medicine in the modern period, in the contemporary period. So if you want to think about sort of the history of Buddhism as having these 4 movements, the history of Buddhist medicine having these 4 movements, I'm gonna get into a little bit of the details of those because I think they're interesting. I am, after all, a historian, so this is kind of one way that I think it's helpful to explain Buddhist medicine. So I'm going to kind of run through this rather quickly, and Frances is going to raise her hand when I'm starting to run out of time, and I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to give you like a taste of a lot of things that we can then come back to and have a conversation about. Once I know what you all are interested in, I'm sort of like laying out the buffet table and watching what you take, and then we can dig into the meal a little bit more if in the Q&A afterwards. So let me just say, if we're going to talk about the early history, the early origins of Buddhist medicine in India, I think what we have to really understand is just the centrality of the role of illness in Buddhist ideas about suffering, about human suffering. Every time Buddhists list the types of suffering that humans experience, illness is always on the list. It's kind of like a central theme within Buddhism. If Buddhism is the religion that promises the relief of suffering, it always includes relief from illness as part of that. Buddhism, by definition, sort of has taken on the role of having ideas about therapy, about healing. One way that comes across in early Buddhist texts is right from the beginning we have an association between some kind of contemplative practice and healing effects. They're not doing mindfulness for that, they're doing other things, but in the earliest texts we have, the Pali texts from early India, they're already connecting contemplative practice with health. Another place that we see this theme come up a lot in early Buddhist texts is in stories. There's all kinds of parables and narratives about various types of different healing activities. Sometimes it's a doctor that's doing healing, and there's a story about that. Sometimes it's a monk or the Buddha himself doing healing, and there's a story about that. So we just see in the texts themselves, a constant concern and thinking about and playing with these health-related themes. A great source, if you want to look at, what does health and wellness look like in a monastic context, is we have, from this early Indian period, we have 5 different monastic disciplinary texts telling monks what they can and can't do in their daily lives. And all of these 5 different monastic codes from different parts of India, they all have a chapter on health and medicine. What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? What kinds of therapies does the Buddha say you can use or not use? And there's often a story attached to those about where these healings are coming from. There's details about what kinds of herbs are being used, what kinds of medicines are being used. And so taken all together, all of these Buddhist sources are really valuable as sources of the history of medicine. We can find out what they were doing in early India for medicine because we have records in these early Buddhist texts. So that's exciting. When we get to later Buddhist history, the development of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, we find some more themes being added on top of what I just talked about. So actually one of the arguments I make in the book is that medicine becomes more central to Buddhism as the history of Buddhism proceeds. And so they're layering more and more medical ideas, health-related ideas on top of one another as the history of Buddhism proceeds. So one thing that becomes very important, it's actually there in early Buddhist texts, it becomes even more critical in later texts, is really thinking about the relationship between mental health and physical health, or how the mind is working and thinking and what the results of that are in your body. That's a constant theme across these Buddhist traditions. Another thing that you see in Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism is the increasing expansion of a repertoire of rituals. So that's like a whole menu of different kinds of rituals you can do for healing, right? And you get more and more of these rituals piled on top of each other. So by the time you get to, second millennium Vajrayana Buddhism, you just have literally thousands of different kinds of rituals that can be done. Basically, any Buddhist ritual can be modified for healing purposes with some tweaks. And we have tons and tons and tons of texts that are outlining these rituals and how to do them. So another place, I'm just talking about sort of themes that become magnified as Buddhist history proceeds. The role of compassion, specifically medical generosity, medical charity, and the idea that somebody who's a Buddhist practitioner should be a bodhisattva out in the world helping others, particularly helping with health and well-being of others. That idea gets built into Buddhism with the Mahayana and becomes more and more prevalent. This is big in China, in Chinese Buddhism, which is my area, as far back as the first couple centuries CE. So as we move forward, I make the argument in the book that medicine, medical care, medical ideas, health, healing, etc., get woven more and more into the fabric of the basic Buddhist teachings, so that medicine was there from the beginning, but it just becomes more and more and more important, more and more of a common theme as the history of Buddhism proceeds. So one of the things that is interesting from kind of a broad perspective that I'm giving you right now is how multifaceted, multidimensional, multifaceted, I already said that, the Buddhist approaches to healing are. So there isn't like one philosophy of medicine that all Buddhists all over the world practice, right? There's multiple different approaches. Sometimes it's let's work with the karma and do some things to fix their karma. Sometimes it's let's call on the deities and have them help us with the healing. Sometimes it's these herbs are really helpful. Sometimes it's, this surgery would be useful. And usually it's like all of those at the same time, right? So you're getting a treatment that's a pill that's been blessed by a bunch of Buddhas and also has some great substance in it. And also, it's been up on the altar and also you're eating it while you're doing mantras. And, it's just like more and more packed in to this healing so that it's operating on multiple levels at the same time. Am I making sense? So so Buddhists seem to be rather flexible in terms of their, epistemology, their way of thinking about what is healing and what is medical and what's valuable and so forth seems not to be kind of limited to, we only do things that are like this, but rather to be very, expansive. This seems helpful. This seems like it might work. Let's combine these things together, right? And this has meant that wherever Buddhism travels, if it travels to China, acupuncture, sure. Qi, yin yang, sure. Right? Buddhist medicine travels to Tibet, and whatever the local plants are, whatever the local traditions are, local spirits, local ideas, sure. Buddhism travels to modern day America. Brain scans? Sure. Why not? Right? There isn't this kind of epistemological narrow vision within the Buddhist tradition that's focusing on just certain ways of doing things. I think that's important. I think that's interesting to me. I don't want to push this too far. One way that you could kind of translate that into maybe modern terminology is to say that Buddhists have for centuries had a really sophisticated notion of the placebo effect. What do I mean by the placebo effect? Usually we say placebo when we want to say, oh, that's just placebo, right? It's something to be controlled for. It's something that we don't take very seriously. It's just placebo. But actually, contemporary placebo research is actually showing that the placebo effect can be skillfully manipulated or skillfully used in all kinds of different therapeutic settings. Right? Did you know, for example, that if doctors are giving you a pill and they tell you this is just a placebo and you take it, you still have the benefits? That's astounding, right? That's crazy, right? And they've also discovered that red pills trigger certain kinds of outcomes and blue pills trigger other kinds of outcomes. The other thing that they've discovered is that, and this is directly relevant to what I was just saying, is the more complicated you make the intervention, the bigger the placebo effect. The more complicated the intervention, the bigger the placebo effect. If you get a really complicated procedure with lots of people doing all kinds of things, it'll be magnified, right? Okay, so I'm not going to say that all Buddhist therapy is placebo, because the story I started with was telling you that the stuff that I thought was placebo turns out to actually be very practically beneficial, right? So I'm not making the argument that, Buddhism is just placebo, but I am making the argument that I think Buddhists know what they're doing with very skillfully creating complex procedures that have a ton of benefit physiologically, socially, etc., but also are activating the placebo effect in very skillful ways. I think we can learn a lot from that. I think that's one of the main after studying this for 25 years, I think that's one of the main things I would say we should learn from Buddhists about this, because I don't think we think about the placebo effect enough, right? We don't think enough about what do our healing environments look like? What do our patient-doctor interactions look like? What colors are the walls painted in the hospitals, right? What's the vibe, right? We don't pay enough attention to those kinds of things. I think Buddhism can teach us a lot there. Okay, this slide is just a boom, 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 boom. I'm going to give you the common menu of Buddhist healing globally. So I said there's cultural differences everywhere. But there is a common menu, actually. When you go around, this is true historically. When you read the text, it's true today. When you travel around the Buddhist world, as I have done, you find the same things everywhere. They look different, they smell different, they sound different, they're presented differently, they use different language, different words, different culture, different framing, but the ingredients are the same. So you will always find herbal medicines. You will always find some kind of dietary practices. Usually it's fasting. In some countries it's vegetarianism. You will always find meditations of all kinds that are helpful for various different kinds of things. You will always find Buddhists chanting scriptures, chanting stuff to help people with health-related illnesses. You will always find some invocation of a healing deity, a Buddha, a bodhisattva. This is a picture of the Buddha's doctor, Jivaka, who is actually the patron saint of Thai medicine. I used to do chanting to the Buddha's doctor, Jivaka, to invoke his healing presence and help in our massage therapies that we were doing. You will always find that those Buddhas, those bodhisattvas, those words, those scriptures, those mantras, whatever they are, can be somehow channeled into objects. And then those objects can be used to heal people. Maybe it's water that we have them drink. Maybe it's food we have them take. Maybe it's pills we have them take. Maybe it's my implement that I then use to do a massage with. There's some way that we can sort of like capture and channel those healing powers to help our patient. We always find exorcisms, how to get rid of ghosts, demons, bad chi, you know, whatever the local terminology is. There's some way of like purging out of the space, out of the patient's body, getting rid of these bad things, and then some kind of protection that we can place around the patient in order to keep those bad things away. I would call that generally talismans, which are kind of things that you hang around, you know, or you put on the body or so forth, or amulets is a specific kind of talisman that you wear around your neck. Incantations, Dharanīs mantras, names of Buddhas, you know, that's different from place to place, but these are, again, kind of a main area of focus. And then another thing to mention is there's these rituals having to do with like purging or getting rid of your bad karma, becoming a better person, becoming more ethical, becoming more moral, right? Cleansing your karma in some way. It is a common refrain too in these Buddhist traditions. That's important to do in order to become healthy and also to maintain health, right? So that's like the general menu of things that you can find from place to place, and of course it looks differently depending on where you go. So one of the reasons that it looks differently from place to place is that Buddhism, right? Buddhism originates in northeastern India, spreads all over Asia, across the Silk Roads, across the maritime routes, and the sort of the fate of what happens to Buddhist ideas in different parts of Asia is different. And I'm going to just really kind of summarize this by pointing to 3 different places. Don't get hung up on the exact boundaries of these bubbles. I don't mean like these circles specifically. I just mean like there, in that part of Asia, you have historical traditions of Buddhism. We have records from all of these places: Afghanistan, Pakistan, northern India, across Indonesia. These were very important Buddhist centers. We have records of Buddhist medicine from those places, but those places converted to Islam and to Hinduism, and those traditions were kind of discontinued, we could say. Buddhist medicine ceased to really be closely associated with Buddhism. Fascinating fact, though, is that a lot of Buddhist techniques actually went underground, were reinterpreted, and are currently being practiced by Muslims, by Hindus, by non-Buddhists all over that region, doing mantras, doing rituals in a Buddhist way. We have a colleague, Project Mukherjee, who did some research in Bengal and found Bengali Muslim healers chanting Buddhist mantras, like literally still doing the same mantras, but they had lost the meaning of those mantras, and it had been sort of reinterpreted into a Muslim kind of framework. Fascinating. So you could say, like in one part of Asia, Buddhist medicine stopped being a major cultural and social force, but it kind of went underground, and it's still, you can find its traces. In another part of Asia, this is the part of Asia that I work with, East Asia, Buddhist medicine coming from India, coming from other parts of Asia into East Asia. Fascinatingly, there was some back and forth about how are we going to translate this? How are we going to make sense of this model of medicine and the body and all this terminology coming from India? So I did my PhD dissertation looking at how Chinese Buddhists were translating Sanskrit into Chinese, and there was some debate and there's arguments for centuries over this. Long story short, they eventually decide, for reasons I won't go into here, they eventually decide we're going to take Buddhist ideas and convert them into Chinese terminology, Chinese models. So all over this part of Asia, they practice Buddhist medicine, but they talk about qi and yin-yang and wuxing and other kinds of Chinese terminology. That Chinese terminology gets translated into Korean, Korean, a little bit in Tibetan too, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, and you have this sort of like East Asian form of Buddhist medicine. The third region that I highlight, this includes Thailand, which is my kind of like ground zero for learning about this from a practice perspective also includes Tibet, also Mongolia, other parts of Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka. It's here that the Buddhist medical ideas coming from India, spreading into these cultures, it's here that these traditions became long-standing, organized traditions of medical practice. So if you go to Tibet, there is a system called Sorigpa, which is a kind of overtly Buddhist form of medicine that's been practiced for centuries there. The teaching supposedly originates from the medicine Buddha himself, and the practice has all of these mantras and rituals and so forth are incorporated into the practice of traditional medicine in that area. Thailand was the same. We learned a form of medicine that was overtly Buddhist, a form of medicine that was practiced in temples, practiced rituals and so forth related to Buddhism. So all over this region, it's like Buddhism sort of planted seeds that then grew into these formal traditions. That's a story about the kind of the regionalization, the regional transformations, regional developments, right, of Buddhism. I want to talk now about the sort of the modern. How does this become modern? How does this become globalized? How does this become the Buddhist medicine that we have today? So first thing I want to mention is that you may be aware that in the 19th century, there was a period of colonial repression of Buddhism all around Asia. You all working on Myanmar know this quite well. Buddhism was seen by colonial powers as being something that was backwards, superstitious, needed to be suppressed, needed to be gotten rid of. In many parts of Asia that weren't colonized, the local people also had that idea, right? They picked up that same idea that Buddhism needed to be, it was superstitious and backwards and needed to be purged from the culture. And so there's this period of time in the 19th century where we find these Buddhist institutions being driven out of medical practice, right? Monks being outlawed from practicing medicine, things like that in various parts of Asia. Again, I'm just giving you the headlines. We can get into some details if you want. But following from this period of oppression, we start to see in the 20th century some Buddhists, we call them apologists. These are Buddhists who think to themselves, you know what? Wait a minute. Buddhism does have something to say to science. Buddhism does have scientific ideas. And they start to try to square or to reframe Buddhist ideas in scientific ways. One of the main ways that happened was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, happened both in Asia and also in North America. One of the main ways this happened was Buddhists saying, you know what, all that stuff about meditation, it actually fits really well with psychology. And they started articulating ideas about how meditation and various kinds of mental practices from Buddhism were actually psychologically therapeutic. Right? So that whole discourse that we now are participating in as a culture that now seems very natural to us, that's when it started. And there's a history to it. Buddhists deciding, you know what? Instead of being superstitious and backwards, actually the Buddha was like a scientist. He knew, he was like a psychologist. He knew what he was doing, right? You've probably heard discourse like this, right? Buddhists started to push back against this oppression and actually started to promote practices like mindfulness, and they started to become really popular. Like I said, that was happening both in Asia and in North America. And then in the 70s, 1979 to be specific, is the first time that you have medical researchers formalizing a protocol, MBSR protocols, so that mindfulness could actually be studied clinically in a lab, right? And once that was done, I don't know how many of you are aware of the PubMed database. It's a database that's collected by the National Library of Medicine in the United States, and it's a database where you can pull all the medical research on a subject, and you can see a graph of when it was published, and what you see is for the word mindfulness, nothing, 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 and then it's like more than exponential, right? So that invention or that creation of the MBSR protocol and then other protocols that followed that, like MBCT, made that kind of research possible. And so that kind of research exploded since the 2000s. So today we have a picture, because what I want you to get the sense of is that all of the things I've talked about still exist today, right? So all of the traditional Buddhist approaches continue to be practiced. Then we have these kind of like apologist approaches that are continue to be practiced, and then we have these kind of more scientific, research-oriented, scientific-oriented, biomedically-oriented practices. Those are also still happening. And so what you have today is these kind of like this patchwork or mosaic of different kinds of organizations all over the world that are doing different kinds of Buddhist medicine, right? Some of them are super traditional, and it's like the practices that they're advocating, you could have seen those done 1,000 years ago. Some of them are combining Buddhist interventions with, or Buddhist therapies with traditional medicine. So this is the one Buddhist hospital in Korea where they're doing Buddhist interventions and acupuncture, herbs, and stuff from the Korean traditional medicine perspective. And then you have places like Suji's hospital in Hualien in Taiwan, where you have Buddhist interventions, Buddhist practices, Buddhist therapies at a biomedical hospital, right? And so these two organizations are massive global organizations. I'm positive you have centers for Suji and Won Buddhism here in Toronto, 100%. They have these huge international networks of hospitals and clinics and are very different in what they're offering to the public, right? And because I'm not here to narrow the definition of Buddhist medicine, I'm going to say they're all Buddhist medicine, right? Okay, I have 5 minutes still? Yeah, all right. So that's a quick overview of the history that I said I would just run through it really super quick, and then we can go back and talk about things that you all are interested in talking about. But I want to give you a quick argument about why I think thinking like I've been kind of laying out and arguing we should, thinking about Buddhist medicine as a thing, as a tradition, as a field, as something to pay attention to, why is that important? Why do I care so much about, why 25 years later am I still on about Buddhist medicine? What is the big deal? I'm going to argue that thinking in this way is going to open up 7 or 8 different kind of new perspectives that I think are important to pay attention to. Okay, so the first one is historical. Sorry, I am after all a historian. When I did my graduate training at Johns Hopkins University in the history of medicine, this was the curriculum, right? I had courses, a lot of it focused on modern biomedicine, colonial medicine, et cetera, but in the sort of global picture of the history of medicine, we learned about the origins of Western medicine, Hippocrates and Galen. We learned about the Indian tradition, the Chinese tradition. We learned about Islamic medicine as this interesting example of cross-cultural circulation that took place between Europe and the Middle East and so forth. And then we learned about sort of the revival of Asian medicine in the modern period, colonial medicine, biomedicine. We learned about all that. Nobody mentioned Buddhism, not even once. Not even once. So a lot of my career really has been about rectifying that missing piece. I, based on my research, based on what I've been able to track, just in terms of the spread of medical ideas from India all around the trade routes, based on everything I was just talking about for the last 20 minutes, I'm going to make the argument that Buddhism turns out to be one of the main contexts for cross-cultural circulation of medical ideas in world history. I'll say that again. Buddhism is one of the main drivers of cross-cultural medical exchange in history, period. But nobody has mentioned that, or nobody mentioned that when I was in graduate school. Why? Well, it's just religion, right? All that stuff, rituals, all that stuff, chanting, that's just religion, right? So when you start to think about Buddhist medicine in the way we've been doing here, we're like, wait a minute, no, this is actually a really important chapter, a really important force in the history of humanity that we've been ignoring. That's argument number, or vista number one. So vista number two is that when we think about, maybe this one's historical too, sorry. But when we think about the history of medicine, when we think about medicine, we often think about traditions. We think about, there's Chinese medicine, there's Indian medicine, there's Tibetan medicine or Soa Rigpa. There's the kind of medicine that they do in the Islamic world, Unani tib. There's the Greco-Roman medical tradition. There's modern medical traditions, right? We think in terms of these silos. And it's true, when you're doing, some of your graduate students, when you're doing graduate training, like you have to learn a language and do your training in that language. And you're not both doing Tibetan and, Khmer usually, right? You usually have to pick a lane and sort of like go into that silo. But when you think about Buddhist medicine as this thing that moves across cultures and is reinterpreted from place to place and picks up different kinds of aspects of the local traditions and circulates. I mean, one thing that's super fascinating is how a medical idea that originates in India can travel to China and then wind up on the Silk Roads and then be exported back down to South India, right? And then some South Indian, migrants bring that idea to Toronto, and they meet some Koreans, and all of a sudden it's this thing, and it's about networks. It's about global connectivity, right? So we can kind of like get out of this silo thinking, like Chinese medicine is Chinese, and Tibetan medicine is Tibetan, and Buddhist medicine kind of cuts across the other direction, and we can see movement, we can see connections. It makes it really hard to study, because if you really wanted to study Buddhist medicine as one single person like me, I would have to learn dozens and dozens and dozens of languages to be able to do it. So what I've been doing is making friends instead, right? I'm friends with people that read all these languages, and we can kind of, it seems to me like it's a more collaborative project just by nature than one person can handle on their own. So I've already talked about language a little bit. So I just want to point out, I already said this, that my dissertation, my first kind of academic book was about the translation that was happening in China. So I do just want to put that on the table too, that if you're paying attention to Buddhist medicine, you are paying attention to something that is again and again and again translated into different languages, again and again translated from who knows what language it was originally in, translated to Sanskrit, then translated into Chinese, then translated into Japanese, then translated into English, right? Now from English translated into Spanish and Portuguese, and I don't know what other languages, right? And so it's just a really fascinating, if you're interested in translation and language and cross-cultural circulation like I am, this is such a fascinating case study. Biomedicine is interesting too. Biomedicine is translated into all those languages too, right? But other than biomedicine, I can't think of too many other forms of medicine that have been translated through as many different cultures and languages as Buddhist medicine. It's really a special kind of fascinating and unique subject. So I've mentioned a few times kind of those boundaries between religion, magic, and medicine, and how we might have those in our mind as kind of rigid categories, right? Oh, this is magic, this is religion, this is science, and so I think one of the implications of being interested in Buddhist medicine is just you have to rethink those categories, and once you rethink them in the case of Buddhism, then you start looking around and thinking to yourself, well, is anything else quite so clear-cut as I thought it was? You look at what happens at the hospital, the doctors with their scrubs, right? You look at sort of the kinds of procedures that are taking place, the way spaces are organized, and you start to think to yourself, well, how much of this is ritual, right? How much of this is, some kind of higher power that we're kind of imagining is intervening in this. How much of this is actually like empowered objects? And medical anthropologists that look at how biomedicine works, they make the argument that a lot of it is ritual, a lot of it is social cues, a lot of it is culturally, culturally derived. But I think Buddhist medicine helps attune us really to look at those kinds of questions, right? What is science? What is medicine? What is religion? And Buddhist medicine helps us to look at sort of like how human beings are trying to make sense of these different categories and mixing them together in interesting ways. And they don't seem quite so defined to me anymore. Okay, so another vista that opens up. I said I had 7 or 8, so I'm on number 5. One more vista that I want to share with you that this kind of thinking opens up is just to kind of like decenter the story of Buddhism and health really just only being about mindfulness. I don't know how it is in Toronto. Around me, if you ask any random person on the street, what's the benefit of Buddhism? They're going to say mental health, right? They're going to say stress reduction. They're going to, it's just everybody knows that mindfulness, that meditation helps with stress reduction. And that's kind of all anybody knows, right? Is that's the whole extent of what they know about Buddhism. And so I think by showing, that tradition, that idea, the contemplative practice is good for your health, that goes all the way back to the beginnings of Buddhism. But there's so much more than just that story. And it's so much more than just mindfulness. There's so many more practices, many more, even just meditations. There's dozens, hundreds of meditations. There's all kinds of different practices that Buddhists are saying are good for health. How many of those have we actually studied? Right? So I wanted to point out before I move to the next slide, my project that is a project I'm doing with students, and I would actually welcome students here to participate if you want to, in kind of like writing little summaries and little blurbs about different Buddhist medical institutions around the world to sort of like get a knowledge base, get sort of like a database of different kinds of places to give people a sense of the wide range of different ways that people are doing Buddhism and medicine. And then we can get away from sort of this exclusive focus on mindfulness and look at sort of look in a more inclusive way at what Buddhists are doing globally. And one of the reasons for doing that is so that we can put maybe we can develop a wider range of interests for scientific study, more than just mindfulness. Nowadays, there's a little bit of research starting with compassion meditation and a couple other types of meditation, but there's so many more possibilities, right? There's so many more ways that Buddhists have been talking about there's so many different techniques and so many different practices that Buddhists have been talking about beneficial for health that I think there's actually quite a lot to be done in this area, and we haven't even scratched the surface. So then number 7, this one's more for the scholars in the room, although it's also an invitation for everybody else. Scholars, present company excluded, of course, but scholars are often, I think, quite myopic in our approach and our thinking about our subject matter. Graduate students in the room know that that's trained into us in graduate school because we have to focus, because we don't know anything and we have to start to become specialists, of course, yes, but I think we often wind up hyper-specializing and really only, I'm interested in what happened in, this one city within this 5-year time period or something like that, right? And I think Buddhist medicine kind of like forces us, if we take that category seriously, it forces us to kind of think a little more broadly, to kind of articulate with colleagues and see how things fit together. And then, beyond scholars, I think it also, taking this topic seriously, kind of invites us to engage with contemporary Buddhists and with all sorts of researchers and other people in the academy and outside the academy that are currently involved with Buddhist medicine. So, so transcending some of our myopic habits and engaging in more of these kinds of transdisciplinary collaborations. Transdisciplinary just means like, interdisciplinary is like between scholars from different fields, but transdisciplinary is like, and also with the general public, also with practitioners, also with Buddhist monks, also with kind of like everybody else that's interested. And so as Francis introduced me as a transdisciplinary scholar, that's been something that I've been very interested in doing, is talking to a wide range of different folks about different stuff. Not so that I can just teach them what I know, but also so I can learn what they know. I've learned so much. I teach in Philadelphia, and I've learned so much from my students, who are, many of them come from Buddhist communities in Philly, and they're teaching me about, well, I don't know, how does the Lao American community do Buddhist medicine? I have no idea, but now I do because my students have been teaching me. And so I always think of opportunities like this, or like talks like this, events like this, to also be an opportunity to learn from you all and to share our perspectives with each other. I think for me, that's very valuable, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and do that with all of you. Okay, so that's what I have to share with you. I know I kind of like blasted through it because I wanted to like lay a lot out on the table. And then I don't know how much time we have left, but all the rest of it, and maybe like after, if they kick us out of the room, if you still want to talk, I'm happy to chat until Francis drags me away. But I'm very eager to hear what all you all are interested in talking about, and maybe I can sort of bring out more details in response to some of your questions. So thank you, and the floor is yours.